Good.
All right, here we go.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Orlando with Ohio Sea Grant and the Ohio Clean Marinas program. I want to welcome you to our 4th week of our aquatic invasive species, or excuse me, broader invasive species webinar series that we are doing with Ohio Sea Grant and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. I'm going to share a screen here to refresh your memory if you've joined us previously, or if you're joining us for the first time, to let you know that this is part of a 5-week series we are doing on aquatic invasive species to raise awareness and help educate Ohioans on what invasive species are and how you can help either prevent their spread, prevent their introduction, or share information about them and their importance to other Ohioans. So we've had three previous webinars on anything from aquatic invasive species, a very broad intro to invasive species, to some campaigns on how you can help prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. We moved into terrestrial invasive plants last week, and then you'll see for today we're going to have a little bit more of some terrestrial organisms, invasive species, as well as some great citizen science engagement mechanisms for those folks that like to get out there in the field and help scientists keep track of these organisms. Next week, for our final installment in the invasive species webinar series, we will have a spotlight on wild boar. So we're focusing on a specific invasive there, and we'll have a speaker with us to talk all about that invasive next Wednesday, August 4th at 10 a.m. All of the webinars are being recorded, and they will be available on the OhioDNR YouTube channel. And if you're interested in next week's event, you can find the link and information about that webinar on the Ohio Clean Marinas Facebook page. So there's a link at the top here. You go to Facebook, look up Clean Marinas, and under our events tab, you'll have all the previous webinars, information about those webinars, and then link for next week's, so you can join us. I'm happy to share that today we have 2 experts from Ohio State University Extension here to join us to talk about invasive species. Our first speaker will be Eugene Bragg, who is the Program Director in Aquatic Ecosystems with OSU Extension. Eugene is a good colleague of mine, and he's been in the invasive species space as well as many other hats for quite some time now, but we're thrilled to have him share his expertise. And then following Eugene's presentation, we will have Amy Stone, who is the Agricultural and Natural Resources Educator in Lucas County, also with OSU Extension. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. And I want to remind for folks who are joining us for the first time in a Teams Live setup, there is a Q&A section, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout today's event. So please feel free to put your questions at any time in the Q&A box, and we'll interact with our speakers a little bit. So with that, I'll pass off to Eugene, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Am I audible? Fantastic. So I'm going to talk specifically about aquatic invasive species and a bit about the GLEDN app. A quick outline, I'll introduce the GLEDN app and the database that it supports. We'll talk a little bit about collecting aquatic plants, about photographing aquatic plants, and then some new invasions of concern to me, in some cases already added to the GLEDN app, but in some cases not quite yet. So the GLEDN app very specifically is an interface with the EDMAPS system. The EDMAPS is a database. EDMAPS stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. And it, in essence, is a database to collect information on invasive species, terrestrial and aquatic. Wherever invasive species are, this database collects information on their distribution and maps where these things happen to be occurring. It's useful in particular because it shares data across several databases. So some of you might be familiar with the iNaturalist database. Once again, this will pull reports of invasives from the iNatural database. Also, a database that I use quite a bit, the U.S. Geological Survey's NAS database, which stands for Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database. This will also pull reports from EDMAPs in order to incorporate into their own database that's very directly used by management agencies in the management of invasive species. And it receives input from regional apps, including GLEDN, which is one of which I'm an administrator. GLEDN stands for the Great Lakes Early Detection Network, which is a smartphone app, right? So you install this app via the link that I believe has been provided to you, and you can use it to identify, photograph, and directly report invasive species, right? Every invasive species has a little catalog of images, so you can compare it to the specimen you see in the field. When you submit a report, it flags that report with the location where your photo was taken. And before the report goes into the database, it is authenticated by professionals who work in the field. And if that is related to an aquatic species in Ohio, that probably means I have to verify your report. So I really want you to submit a good report to minimize the legwork I have to do to approve your report. So let's quickly talk about collecting aquatic plants. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about algae. I want you to know that algae are in the water next to plants and they look different than plants. The reason we're not going to talk about algae is because it really takes some expertise and some familiarity with both the organisms and the use of a microscope to confidently identify them to species. You're not going to find a lot of networks, a lot of venues to report invasive algae without some specialized training. So know that they're out there, know that they're next to plants, but we're not going to talk a lot about algae today. We are going to talk about vascular plants, right? Plants with differentiated organs like stems, leaves, and roots, flowers, etc. And when we talk about plants in the water, we often refer to them by the term macrophyte, which just means a plant that's big enough that you can see it with the naked eye, thus macrophyte. And if you're trying to identify aquatic plants, most references will start by identifying them to growth form first, right? So if you have a book on aquatic plants, it might talk about the emergent plants. And those are the plants that have stiff stems that can support themselves up into the air, right? They might be rooted in shallow water or along the shoreline, but a lot like terrestrial plants, they just happen to be in or very close to the water. Moving on a little bit, we have plants that root in the water and send leaves up to float on the surface. Things like water lilies. Conveniently enough, those plants are referred to as floating leaved. And if you move out a bit further, you'll find those classic seaweeds that are sunk underwater. Those are what we call submerged, right? They tend to have rather flaccid stems. If you were to pluck a submerged plant and bring it out into the air, it would not be able to support its weight. It would just kind of collapse. Now, some of them will have flowering structures that they send up above the water, but some of them are wholly submerged, right? So there are kind of degrees of submergedness. When you're collecting, you'll see some people talk about collecting algae with a stick. And when we're talking about an algae, especially once we're talking about a filamentous algae, once its filaments have broken loose from the substrate and floated to the surface to form a mat, yeah, this is a viable way to collect algae. But when we're talking about rooted things, sticks have very limited utility. It's very difficult to tease a tough root out of the substrate and get it to stay on a stick long enough for you to get it to you if you're standing on the shoreline. So sticks have limited use. You might find some use for a stick, but again, probably not for the more toughly rooted macrophytes. You can go to a specialized website where they sell professional equipment and purchase commercial rakes or forks that are designed specifically to sample aquatic plants. If you're that ambitious, though, you're probably dropping a few $100s on a piece of equipment like this. There are also guides out there where you can just buy a standard garden rake and do a little bit of duct taping or welding and improvise really handy samplers with standard garden equipment with a little bit of modification. Drop me a line if you want to talk more about that. However, you can go to a site like Amazon or any other big commercial site and buy, or sporting goods places, and buy grappling hooks. Right? Grappling hooks are a really useful tool. Very often you can get one for 20 bucks or less. with some variability, right? Some of them will go up to over $100, but a tool like this might put you back 20 bucks, and it's a really good tool for collecting aquatic plants. If it's not obvious, you just toss it out there and drag it back in with that rope, and you collect a bunch of plants on the tines of the hook. If you're an avid angler, you can improvise with fishing tackle, but there are some limitations to that as well, because rooted plants can be really tough, and things that there are things that are likely to break your line depending. So if you want to improvise using fishing tackle, I personally recommend things like large spoons with large treble hooks, and casting gear with heavy braided line. Braided line is much harder to break than typical monofilament lines. Now, if you have other gear like spinning tackle with heavy monofilament lines, you can try for it, but know that it's more susceptible to abrasion and breaking, and so be careful with that. Be careful to use lures that aren't very important to you, because there's a greater chance that you're going to lose them in trying to collect a plant. Let's quickly talk about photographing aquatic plants, because this is often the tool by which, it might be the only tool by which I have access to verify a report that's submitted to a database. So if you go to the EDMAP site, you will find a page specifically to provide guidance on taking good photographs. And this is a very good page. Because of the nature of most of the people in the out of doors, it's going to mostly focus on things that grow on the land. It's going to focus on terrestrial species, right? But I'm really interested in aquatic things. So check out this photograph advice page on the EDMAP system. It's very useful. I'm not going to address what's on there already, because it's already there and you can access it. I am going to talk about some specifics of photographing aquatic plants, okay? So start by, when you harvest your specimens, select a background to put the specimens against that provide maximum contrast. Very often we're talking about dark specimens, so put them, if the specimen is dark indeed, put it against a pale background, for example, to provide maximum contrast. If you can, array the specimen to capture identifying characteristics, to maximally capture identifying characteristics, right? So this is a really excellent photograph. You can see the stem, you can see the way leaves are attached to the stem, but then this photographer has taken a whorl of leaves from around a stem and splayed it out. I can count the pinnae on these compound leaves and accurately identify the specimen from a photograph. Include an object of known size for scale, right? And this object might be a coin, ruler, a human hand, any of the above. Also, pull back the photograph and capture details of how the stand is growing in its environment. That's often useful as well. So not only show me the individual specimens, but show me the entire stand of the growth out in its environment. EDMAPS allows the upload of 5 photos per report, and so take full advantage of that. Now, don't submit 5 images of essentially the same thing. Submit 5 as differently contrasted images that capture those identifying characteristics as you possibly can. So take full advantage of the permission to upload 5 images. So here are just a few examples of pretty good photos to varying degrees that offer an object for scale, that offer individual specimens where I can see a fair amount of detail. I'm going to show you now some photos that have been sent to me individually that I simply couldn't tell anything about what I was looking at, right? So don't send me these photos, send me these photos, or better yet, send me these photos. So I'm going to talk about a few species of concern that are either now added or about to be added to the GLEDN app. And to do that, I'm going to refer to a field guide that I co-edited with some other Ohio authors. This, if you can get to a Division of Wildlife office, you might find this in hard copy. However, know that the hard copies move very, very quickly. So once it's printed, the print versions don't last long. If you want to, though, you can feel free to visit this URL, which I believe will be shared with you, and you can download the electronic version But the hard copies are quite nice because some of them, not all of them, some of them are printed actually on waterproof paper, so it's nice and field durable. So grab a copy of this, it's useful. And I'm going to use it just to introduce these species of concern, of recent concern to me. It's a much bigger book, right? It really touches on literally more than 100 species, but I'm only going to touch on a few of concern to me because they're recently on the move. And if you open the field guide, you'll see a couple of icons. So if you see this red phone icon, this is a new enough invasion that's of enough concern that if you come across it, you should report it. And at the beginning of the book, you'll find instructions on how to report it. You'll also find a really nice section on identification of the plant, including some nice line drawings that idealize those features that you should look for to identify the species. And of course, you'll find a little description of similar species so that you don't get confused into describing a native species as something that's an invasive, so you can contrast against our native species as well. So the first one, if it's not evident, I'm going to talk about is European frogbit. European frogbit, it looks a lot like some of our native water lily-like plants. However, water lilies or other species in general are larger in every dimension than European frogbit. European frogbit is tiny. We're talking about leaves that only span a little more than 2.5 inches. We're talking about flowers that are only about less than ½ inch across. Okay, and the flowers, well, you can see here, the flowers have 3 petals, are white, very showy, but they are tiny, right? So like a lily, but tiny in every dimension. They're dioecious, which means that the different sexes of the plant occur on different individual plants. Okay, so ordinarily when you find a stand of this stuff in the wild, it is reproducing only vegetatively, and it is usually a single sex only present, which I think is fascinating because that's a hard way to get a lot of propagation, but this stuff propagates really aggressively, like I would not expect of a dioecious species with a single sex stand. It does send down roots, but they're free floating. The roots don't ordinarily attach to the substrate, so it's just a mat with dangly roots floating around on the surface. It likes calcium-rich water. It forms these big monotypic stands that choke out native plants and can change wetland function. It was first documented officially by public databases in Old Woman Creek in 2017. Now, I've spoken with a state botanist who told me that he collected it earlier on the Lake Erie Islands, but it wasn't shared with the public earlier. So as far as I can tell, the first public records of this document, of this plant, occurred in 2017. And by 2019, it had, from that first detection in only 2 years, it was everywhere across Northeast Ohio's marshes. So for example, if you happen to go birding and like McGee Marsh, here is one of the marshy canals associated with the marsh complex out there. All of this blanket of green, of tiny green leaves is European frogbit, and I shot this in 2019. If I was there the year before and you see the water lilies, the bigger leaves in the distance, it was all open water but water lilies in 2018. By 2019, the site looked like this. Yellow floating heart is the next one I want to talk about, and you will see again it is a water lily-like plant. However, its leaves again are somewhat smaller than our native water lilies. The leaves get to be at about 6 inches across at max, and they're more heart-shaped. Okay, so the notch is more rounded than our native water lilies will be. It has very showy 5-petaled flowers, which are yellow, thus the name, but they have a very distinctively frilly margin. The flowers are frilled, which you might be able to catch a little bit of that in this image. It's really obvious if you see the stuff in person. It has very hairy seeds that are easily picked up and carried about by especially waterfowl. It persists a very long time via these tuberous rhizomes that can store energy and regenerate for a long period of time from mudflats later whenever the flooding conditions are right for them. Monotypic stands choke out our native plants, right? So one of the things with water lily-like plants is if they cover the surface, they shade out everything else below and kind of eliminate competition. The problem with this is that when you have a dense stand of yellow floating heart, its leaves are really prone to cupping, and they hold small stagnant pools of water, which are excellent places for mosquitoes to breed. So if this stuff takes over, it tends to really increase the number of mosquitoes you find around. And this was a plant that was introduced as an ornamental because it's pretty decades ago. However, it seemed to stall shortly after introduction, but then there were several new reports from several Ohio counties going up into 2019. 2020 was kind of off because it was a weird year, but I'm sure there are new reports that we will glean soon when people begin going out of their homes again. The last plant I want to talk about is pink lotus. Okay, pink lotus is very similar to our native species. We have a native, which is American water lotus. The American water lotus has mostly yellowish with some greenish and orangish tinge to the flowers. Conveniently enough, the pink lotus has pink flowers, if it's the wild form, or pink-white among cultivated strains. Also, if you're really familiar with lotuses, you'll notice that the pink lotus has, the lotuses in general have very distinct seed capsules. The seed capsule on a pink lotus, on average, tends to be narrower than the seed capsules of our native lotus. And these are really big. So this is a plant whose potential invasiveness has not been assessed because old historical literature considered Ohio to be too far north. But I think that's changing, and I think that perhaps those earlier observation-based notes don't really apply because not a lot of people had endeavored to introduce pink lotus.
Hi folks, I'm just going to chime in. Eugene, I think we're getting a little bit of a delay, maybe because of a connection issue. So I might recommend, we'll want to see your face a little bit later, maybe shutting off your video to help with connection. And I may switch over, if we do lose Eugene, Amy, I may have you on standby. And that way we'll come back and finish up with Eugene. I think we got a little bit of a connection issue there. I'm going to go ahead and, Amy, if you're ready, we're going to switch over to hear about some insects, I believe, that are of concern of Ohio. And I want to say thank you to Eugene. I personally am one who likes citizen science. I think he's going to try coming back on. But there's lots of great opportunities, whether you're literally out in the field with some of your kids and looking to teach them about ways to be observant of their environment and help become engaged in our research and education that's going on across Ohio about these organisms. Or if you're somebody that is very interested and on top of this topic and you already like identifying plants or looking at organisms and are looking for additional ways to interact with the research community and with the educators that work on this every day, those are just some good opportunities of ways to do so. Eugene, I think he's joining us back. He will, correct me if I'm wrong, be on for the rest of the webinar. So if we do have any questions, or maybe we'll close up some discussion at the end. But at this point, I'm going to switch over to Amy Stone, who is also with OSU Extension, to cover some insects that we have for Ohio.
All right,
Thanks,
Sarah.
Yep.
Can you see my screen? All
yes.
right. Okay, so I am going to cover some insects that actually you should be kind of on the radar, and potentially if you see these, make sure that you're reporting them in the GLEDN app that Eugene talked about. Before I jump into the actual insects, I just want to share a couple resources or web pages that I like. The first is invasive.org. It includes information about plants, insects, pathogens, and really all other species. And so if you kind of get bitten by that invasive species bug and want to find out more about what's going on, this is a great resource. Additionally, I am one of the writers for our Buckeye Yard and Garden line, and often will put invasive species updates in alerts. And so you can subscribe to that to receive invasive species information as well as general horticulture information. The first insect I want to cover is Asian longhorn beetle. This is a map to show you, as of today, where these populations are or have been. And you can see the populations that are in green actually have been eradicated or eliminated. So that's really good news, and there are a lot of boxes with green text in them. You will notice, though, there are 4 boxes that have red text, including the infestation in Worcester, Massachusetts, Central Long Island in New York, the infestation in Claremont County, Ohio, so southwest Ohio, just outside of Cincinnati, and the most recent infestation in South Carolina. The Asian longhorn beetle is a cerambycid. We do have some native longhorn beetles that often some people may get confused, but I really encourage you, if you see a beetle that you think is Asian longhorn beetle, capture the insect, take photos like Eugene had mentioned earlier, report that, and let somebody else kind of be that deciding factor. We'd much rather have people send in reports that are negative than miss a report that's positive and have that population continue to expand. So the Asian longhorn beetle is a large beetle. With the antenna, it can be 1.5 inches to 2 inches in length. Now this slide on the right is a little bit larger and kind of added to, but hopefully got your attention and at least maybe cracked a smile. The females are larger, not quite this large, but again, hopefully trying to encourage you to enjoy the invasive species and while you're learning. What you're looking for, though, in addition to the beetle itself, you'll see on this photo are the egg-laying sites. So she chews a divot and places individual eggs, and so those are very evident during the summer while she's doing that. And you can see there's some bleeding around where that injury occurred. Additionally, when the insect leaves the tree as an adult, it leaves a perfectly round exit hole, almost to the preciseness that somebody drilled into the tree. And you can stick a number 2 pencil right into that hole. So it's quite sizable and easy to pick up by the eye. You can see there can be multiple holes, both the egg-laying sites and the exit holes, and we tend to see them early on where 2 branches come together. Once a tree is heavily infested, they will line the tree from the top near the ground all the way up into the canopy. Right now, if we look at the life cycle of this insect, we have adult beetles that are out there, so they're feeding, mating, and laying eggs for the next generation. The damage that occurs really is in that larval stage, and that's what's killing the trees. And all stages of the insect, except the adults, can survive our winters. So in the fall, as temperatures cool, the adult beetles will die. It did come from Eastern Asia, so China, the Koreas, and why it's such a huge concern is the large host range. So you can see here it likes maples, horse chestnuts and buckeyes, elms and willows, but there's a whole host of other plants. And so just imagine your own landscape. I'm sure that somebody has at least one of those species that could be impacted if Asian longhorn beetle were to arrive near you. In addition to the GLEDN app, you can also report this on the USDA site. And again, they're going to want signs or symptoms of that damage through photos. The next one is actually an insect that is kind of in the past, right, maybe off of people's radars, although we are seeing populations build back up in lower numbers if there are ash trees that are still around. This is an agrylus species, so a relative to our native bronze birch borer, a very beautiful small insect about the size of a tic tac for the adults. But this is just an illustration of how far spread emerald ash borer is. And unfortunately, this is an insect, an invasive species that will not be eradicated or eliminated like the goal of the Asian longhorn beetle. And this really illustrates the progression of messaging. So early on it was to eradicate, and then we realized that the insect had spread out much further. So there's a lot of research going on ash resistance. So what trees can we put back into the landscape in our woodlots that have some resistance to the insect? And just a reminder, this was an insect that just wiped out billions of ash trees and continues to do so as it spreads across North America. And so that's a street in Toledo. And this is just looking down the opposite end of the street where the trees had already been removed. Additionally, if you still have ash trees that are standing, they typically don't stand very long and become a hazard. And we call those ash snaps. And so it really is a concern if you haven't addressed those dead standing ash and really need to learn more about that. They can snap off at the base, kind of be pulled out of the ground, all the way up to about 6 feet they can snap off. So just a reminder of some things to look for, and I mention this just because there are individuals who have been treating ash trees. They've stopped that treatment because they thought emerald ash borer was gone, and we again are seeing a little bit of resurgence. So if you see some woodpecker activity on an ash tree, you may want to kind of look in there a little bit closer because you may have a building population. Additionally, we have invasive plants that have taken over and people that are dealing with that after emerald ash borer. And on the flip side is we have an opportunity to really diversify our landscapes, our urban forests and woodlots where once we had a lot of ash trees. Another insect that I just want to mention briefly is the gypsy moth. This is an insect that came to the United States in the 1800s, so it's been around for a long time. And this map just illustrates where the initial point of introduction was and how it spread westward. So there are 3 management zones, and here in Ohio we actually have all 3 zones. So there is a suppression zone, which is an area that has been infested and often will, maybe be killer for a few years, but then we'll see the populations build up again. There's the leading edge that we call slow the spread, and we actually have an area of eradication efforts. And so if there was a find in front of that leading edge, there would be some management techniques performed to hopefully eradicate and eliminate that hot spot so the population doesn't build as fast. So the suppression is the red, the slow the spread is that yellow, again, that leading edge, and finally the eradication. And the goal is to really slow that spread so states to the west don't have to deal with gypsy moth any sooner. This is the scientist that actually brought over gypsy moth. He was hoping to cross breed with a native silkworm, and that was his laboratory, his space, his house where he did that work. And then the photo to the right is one of my favorite historical photos. If you look really closely, there are people up in that tree actually removing egg masses. So that was kind of the first eradication efforts that were occurring. The gypsy moth starts in the egg mass stage, and they actually spend 9 months out of their life in that stage. And so it's in the late summer, fall, and into the winter and early spring. And so that's a good time to go out and look to see if you have populations. In the spring, when redbud is blooming, the gypsy moth caterpillars hatch. And you can see there's the defoliation that occurs, and that's why there is a concern, because that can very much stress trees out, and that repeat defoliation can cause death. Death does occur in a single season if they're feeding on spruce trees and other evergreens. Here's a full-grown caterpillar, and you can see there's really nothing else like that. If you take a look, it has pairs of blue and red dots, and they're quite hairy. Those caterpillars pupate, and then they emerge as adults. So the male moth is the brown moth in the foreground on the left, and the female is in the back. She does not fly. She gives off a pheromone. He finds her, they mate, and then she lays eggs for that next generation. The next insect I want to talk about is spotted lanternfly. And if you haven't heard about spotted lanternfly, you need to kind of get up to speed, because this is kind of the next one that we are anticipating that will be popping up in Ohio. Here's a map that was actually just updated. You can see there is one county in Ohio, Jefferson County, along the West Virginia border. And then there is a new find in Indiana, very near Ohio, and of course Kentucky. The bulk of the infestation is in Pennsylvania, but it definitely has spread out. Berks County, just outside of Philadelphia, where it was initially found. It is a plant hopper, although many people describe it as moth-like or moth in appearance. It's about 1 inch long and a 1/2 inch wide. There can be a little difference in sizes. Both the adults and the nymphs feed by piercing, sucking mouth parts, so they're stem feeders, and so that's what's causing the distress to the plants that they feed on. They're not outright killers, but rather can stress the tree and open it up to other injury and even winter kill, especially with one of the plants that I'm going to mention just briefly. Right now, the adults have just started to emerge, and those are the ones that you'll likely see. They're a little bit larger in size, more showy, and that's often the reports that we get across North America were from that stage. Although they're big and beautiful, and I describe them as very vivid, there are 13 spotted lanternfly adults, and they kind of camouflage into that bark. So you still have to kind of be on the lookout for them. Those adult females will lay eggs, and there's usually between 30 and 50 eggs in one of the masses. And those eggs then are covered with this waxy coating to help protect them. And you can see here, they can be laid on any surface. So here it's on a tree, but they could be laid on stone, on a doghouse, on a vehicle. And so you just have to really be alert, because this is a hitchhiker, and that is predominantly how it's spreading so greatly and rapidly. You can see here, this is just a combination of the gypsy moth egg mass, that's kind of that lighter tan color, and then 2 spotted lanternfly egg masses. And so unfortunately, this area is being hit with both invasive species. Those eggs, again, can be laid on any surface. And so just showing you, sometimes they stand out, other times they kind of blend right in. They do have kind of an affinity, or a liking to rusty things. So like this barrel, and you can see the massive amount of egg masses at the base. There's also a concern that they will lay eggs on train cars, and who knows where that train car is going to be when those nymphs hatch the following spring. And so we're really looking at those kind of transportation corridors of how this insect would come into Ohio in different locations. So just a quick life cycle description. You know, the nymphs, they hatch in the spring. They go through 4 instars. The first instars are black and white, along with the second and third. They start out just very tiny. People describe them almost tick-like. The 4th instar, though, they begin developing this reddish color, a little bit more easy to see in those trees. And then after that nymph stage, they'll then go into the adults. This just gives you a nice calendar of what to look for when. And so you can see on that line between July and August, we've got nymphal activity as well as the beginning of adults. And so right now, if you were out and they were present, you could see both. The eggs, again, we're very concerned about that human-assisted spread. The adults themselves are weak flyers, so they can actually climb up and like on a telephone pole or tall surfaces and kind of catapult them, but it's not going to get them great distances. The concern, though, is spotted lanternfly likes tree of heaven, which if you are into invasive plants, you may cheer and think, oh gosh, maybe this is a biological control. But they also like grapes, and now the list is over 100 other species that they found to be feeding upon. So check for egg masses, late into the fall and spring. Again, take photos and report anything that you suspect might be spotted lanternfly. We're seeing and coming to the end of the cycle for the nymphs, but there would still be some of those out there. And finally, going forward into the late summer in the fall, we would see adult activity. And you can really focus on Ailanthus or tree of heaven because that definitely is a preference, especially for the adults. You may see heavy sap flow, so when they pierce in to get the sap from the plant, when they pull out, you'll still get some sap running. Additionally, we'll see some wasp and hornets, and that result of the sooty mold or of the sap and then their honeydew or excrement, we see black sooty mold on the forest floor or on the leaves below where they've been feeding. In fact, in Pennsylvania, it wasn't really about spotted lanternfly that was the initial detection. A homeowner was concerned that they were seeing a lot of wasp and hornets around the Ailanthus and wondered what was happening. And so when scientists in the Pennsylvania's Department of Agriculture visited, they did see the wasp and hornets, but they also found the spotted lanternfly. So those are some insects to be on the radar. Of course, there are others. If you have questions about those insects or that I've covered today or other insects or how to report those, I'd be glad to answer those questions.
Thank you. Would you mind for a second? Again. Awesome. Can you guys hear me better? Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to mention I'm going to include a link to the OSU Extension and School of Environment and Natural Resources Invasive Species website that has some more information and resources and lots of guidance and links off of this main page, as well as link to what's known as the Aquatic Invasive Species Committee for the state of Ohio. That's on the OSU website, but it's a multi-agency, multi-organization partnership on aquatic invasives. And then Amy, I want to double check. I believe that you might have had a survey or maybe a link to some more information, or if trying to get a survey out to folks on some of these invasive insects. So correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm going to mute myself while I'm putting these links up. And if folks are still with us, please do feel free to put any questions or comments that you may have in the Q&A.
Yeah, Sarah, thanks for that. I unfortunately didn't get it updated for this talk, so.
No worries, that is fine. I'm going to just put this link in here. This, and then and then Eugene has been able to join us. Eugene, I want to give you, while I'm putting this link in here, another chance to, I know we lost you for internet connection there, if you have any closing thoughts or closing comments. So I'm going to mute myself here.
So at your leisure, I have more slides I can finish with, or not at your leisure. So your choice. I was just going to, I have some to finish up about pink lotus and some on a fish.
I would say go ahead. We have about 5 more minutes. So thanks, Eugene.
Okay. So I'm told this is where we left off. I know of at least 3 sustaining populations of pink lotus reported from Ohio's southern counties, and just last week I shot this photo of a retention pond in Delaware County. Right, so it's obviously established there. It's obviously reproducing and spreading. Pink lotus is in Ohio. The last species I want to talk about is the oriental weatherfish, not in Ohio by the time our invasive species field guide was published. It doesn't really look like anything else. It's kind of related to minnows, but it has this worm-like body profile. First collected from Ohio's Pickaway County in June of 2019, where 19 specimens were collected on an obvious spawning run onto a flooded road. And then there were 2 additional Franklin County collections in 2020. They spawn in flooded riparian areas from small organic rich streams, tend to become abundant where established, but it's not yet known if they will become what we consider to be invasive. They might displace native fishes through competition. They might feed on native fish eggs. However, there's not a lot known about these things in our environment yet. And so, yeah, I can take questions too, but the real purpose of this slide is to look at pictures of myself with fish. And this is where you can find me. And I've arrived at the end of all of my slides. So there was a little delay between, but here we is. So I'm happy to take questions as well.
That's good. Thanks, Eugene. One question I guess I will pose to both you and Amy is, and you've already kind of shared this, but just to reiterate for the audience and especially for folks that may find this on YouTube down the road, what's if someone has, you know, for someone who has no knowledge or very little experience with either invasive plants or invasive insects or animals, what's like one thing that you would recommend that they could do to help with the invasive species fight, I guess we could say, in Ohio? And then for folks that are more advanced, what would you recommend if there's even volunteer opportunities or if they're really, you know, want to learn more? So kind of both ends of the spectrum, just the one thing. Yeah.
So I guess I will start. If you're not familiar with the organisms, if you're not intimately familiar with the organisms, if you don't feel particularly biology-like, you can certainly install an app like GLEDN and look at the images in there to start. But I would also recommend that you familiarize yourself with the landscape that you do know and look for changes in that landscape. There is a new organism here that you've not seen before. Maybe take a little bit of time. If that organism suddenly becomes very abundant and you've not seen it before, take a little bit of time to try to identify that new organism. And I think that's a kind of a good way to introduce yourself to the citizen science of invasive species. And get active with local organizations. So, for example, through the Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist Program, lots of parks take on volunteers to help staff events, to help work their properties, and that comes with a certain amount of training, and that's something anybody could engage in, and there's likely a chapter close to you, so look for those chapters. Get involved as suits you and your interests.
Those are some great things, ditto to what Eugene said. But really just get out and enjoy nature. And, you know, if you see something that's strange or unusual, you hadn't seen before, like Eugene described, populations just growing pretty rapidly, take a photo, take a collection, call, you know, your local extension office, a connection that you have in the community, the Department of Agriculture, to get that species identified. And it may be something that's native that you just haven't experienced before, or maybe it's invasive, but there currently aren't management, you know, broad management opportunities. And so, yeah, just keep educating yourself and stay up to date.
Those are both really good points, and thank you again for your time, your expertise, and for offering opportunities for Ohioans of all interests and backgrounds to become engaged on this important topic. Thank you all again for joining us. Next week, we'll have our final episode in the series on wild boar, so please join us August 4th at 10 a.m. And if this is after the fact, we hope you'll check out more of our invasive species webinar series on the ODNR YouTube channel. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.